Hello, pod smashers of the internet, and welcome to another episode of 80-Bit Pod Smash, where gaming goes to grab a beer. I'm your host, Penguin, and as you are all probably quite aware of the salacious news from Termite that is exploding all over the Twitterverse right now, he will not be joining us tonight. And instead, I would like to introduce you all to our friend and friend of the show and now time co-host, Ryan, aka JavaFiend, who joined us on an episode a while back. So welcome, Ryan. Hello. Welcome to an episode that you probably actually give a crap about talking about.
Thank you. It's actually a very, very extreme pleasure to be back. I am honored to be back on your show, co-hosting after Danny's demise and his downfall.
Yes. Before we get too far into you guys starting to then Google this, It is not that. Termite, this is the first time we've ever had to not record together. It's because life is really crazy right now. Termite is moving, as he mentioned in the last. That's his salacious news. That's so offensive, is he's moving. We're all very sad about it, but not really. We're also really happy for him. But him and his family are moving, so he's got a lot to do right now. And although, ironically, right now, he's on vacation. So we had to make some last-minute adjustments. We were going to record an episode about the Xbox One as part of our Soul in the Console series, but again, because he had to get things ready for the house and had to get things ready for his vacation with his family, we were unable to record when we wanted to record, so I asked our good friend Ryan to fill in tonight, and he is graciously doing so for us. So we're doing this episode instead, where we are going to be talking about mythology in video games, very much so inspired by the recent announcement of God of War Ragnarok, re-announcement of it, I guess, reveal of it.
Reveal,
PlayStation. Yeah, showcase. So we'll be talking a lot about God of War, but we're also going to be talking about mythology in general and video games that either utilize mythology or are set in a mythological setting. So that is what we are talking about tonight. But we are where gaming goes to grab a beer. So do you have a drink tonight, Ryan? And what are you drinking?
I do have a drink. I'm actually drinking a hefty pour of Legend whiskey. It's a whiskey I discovered a few months ago. Please don't ask me to, speak to the notes that make it special. I'm still dipping my toes in that water.
Sure.
But I enjoy it. And also my birthday was recently, and I was pleasantly surprised to receive a, nifty whiskey decanter and a set of glasses from my brother and his wife from a birthday present. So I poured that Legend into the decanter, and this is my first pour out of it since then in my fancy new Cairn glasses. So
ooh, nice.
Yeah.
That sounds delicious. I am also not very great about talking about beer, and we've been doing this podcast for 200 episodes, and I feel like the biggest poser, but I like to think people listen to our show mostly for the video game stuff, and the beer is just a fun little bit, and that people aren't coming for serious beer or alcohol, reviews here. But right. I am drinking Wood Booger from Strange Ways Brewery, a Belgian-style brown ale. I love Strange Ways. It's a local brewery. Saw they had this at Food Lion, which is awesome because they don't frequently have, they have local stuff, but it's usually the bigger local breweries. So, Strange Ways, the fact that they saw Strange Ways is awesome. But this one does have a nice little thing to read on it, which does a better job of describing it than I can. It's no hoax. You've spotted the elusive wood booger, Bigfoot-like creature that roams the Appalachians of Virginia. Numerous sightings of this beast have occurred over time, but your adventure is only now beginning. This sounds like a great video game. Let's make a wood booger game. Examine its habits, and you'll uncover footprints of vanilla bean, coconut sugar, and roasted malt, with subtle traces of dark chocolate and caramel. The beast will show you a sweet side, tempting you to let down your guard, but keep your wits about you, because as quickly as it reveals itself, it will vanish. So I guess that means it's only going to be in the store for a limited time. It's good. It's strange. That's the only way to describe it. One of the things I like about Strange Ways is their flavors are always unique. So when they say Belgian style brown ale, I know what a Belgian tastes like, and I know what a brown ale tastes like, and this doesn't necessarily taste like either of them, and also does at the same time. It's definitely got a little bit of sweetness to it, but it's got kind of a funk to it, which I'm into. So yeah, Wood Booger, check it out, guys. It.
Hot take, because while you were saying that, and you made the offhand comment about Sasquatch video game. I just had a thought for a video game. Free content here, game creators, if you want to go with it.
Man.
So I've never played it, but you know that game that's like Friday the 13th, and it's like Jason and versus a bunch of campers. And,
oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so take that basic model, but kind of reverse it. So you're Sasquatch in the woods, or you're one of several hunters trying to find Sasquatch. And in a certain amount of time, can you either elude the hunters, or can you find Sasquatch as a team? And obviously you have to give Sasquatch like certain abilities to offset that. But I'm just saying there's a Sasquatch hunter game out there that somebody needs to make.
I love it. All right. Well, we're going to jump right into our first segment. We're going to skip favorite things because mostly because we want to leave room for our discussion here because we think it's going to be a good one. But as our friend Ryan here is a huge fan of DLC, that was one of the first pieces of feedback we ever got on the podcast was DLC's awesome. So I wanted to make extra special one for Ryan here. So we're going to jump right into our first segment of the show, which is DLC. DLC stands for downloadable content. It is a segment of our show where we have a little fun game, a little discussion that you wouldn't normally have about video games. It is titled downloadable content because Termite and I's names are both Daniel, and so we thought we'd have a fun little DLC downloadable content pun and call it downloadable content. I guess we'll have to call it Dan Ryanable content now, but whatever.
Well, remember, my middle name is still Daniel. I'm still a Daniel.
That's right. You are Dan Loadable at heart.
That's right.
So yes, I come up with a prompt ahead of time for downloadable content, and then we discuss it kind of live without having much prior thought to it. Of course, I had the advantage of having had prior thought to it since I came up to it, but this is fun because DLC is usually like 2 sentences or at most whenever I come up with them for Termite. And not gonna lie, sometimes I literally come up with DLCs on the spot. But I feel great today because this is like almost a paragraph of setup here. So I think you'll like this. All right, so I'm gonna set the stage here, and I'm gonna put on my like narrator voice here. Ready? It is the far future, and modern civilization has collapsed, relegated to the annals of history. A new civilization of humans have arisen from the ashes, and they have progressed far enough to have their own historians. And their historians and archaeologists have stumbled across the myths and legends of the past, or our current time, and they have discovered an ancient tome that they have translated to the Divine Shattered Fraternity, which is a rough translation of the work of art that we know as Super Smash Bros. What Smash characters do they think were our gods? What Smash characters do they think were our monsters? And what do they perceive of this religion looking like and how it affects our daily lives?
Okay. All right. So really quickly, do they have access to all of the games that we currently know about?
I don't think so, because the technology, they probably can see. I would say they have access to the games, they have access to the consoles, but they don't know how to make them work. They don't have the ability to make them work. Maybe they've seen the promotional material. I just really need to know what part of the roster have they looked at. That's really all I need to know. What am I working with here? You can pull from Ultimate since it has all the characters.
Fair.
But it's mostly what they have is they don't have the inputs, right? So they can't plug in because that's all lost to history. They have no idea how to make that stuff work. Even if they have electricity, they're all different inputs and stuff. The big thing is they have all like various writings about it. So they have access to both like the stuff about the game, I guess, like the writing, the manuals and stuff like that, the scripts.
Yeah.
Those are like the sacred writings, but they also have writings about the writings. So they have access to, I guess, Reddit transcripts and stuff like that from the Smash Bros. Subreddit. So they have access and they have uncovered like, some of the discourse around the game as well as the game's content itself to some level.
Well,
obviously they don't know what it all means, but they have some idea.
Okay, so they have. So if we're going to use a few different archetypes from mythology, there's going to be, I don't know why this is not the main one, but this is the first thing that comes to mind. They're going to have like the triad goddess aspect. if you want to call it Hecate, if you want to call it the Fates or the
Yes,
Furies
I
or
think I know
whatever.
where you're going with
Like, well, I don't know if you do, because what I'm thinking is you got to pick 3 female characters that embody that, and they have to all look kind of alike, but not the same.
I think I know where you're going with it.
So they're gonna identify Peach, Daisy, and Rosalina as like it's like the triad goddess figure. They won't.
They bet they
understand
think
it.
that she was like but like as opposed to like a the Fates or like the 3 witches from Macbeth. Where it's sort of a dark figure. I mean, clearly these characters are bright and happy, so they must think of them as collectively like a trinity of love goddess. Like they're 3 in 1 because they look all the same, but they express themselves differently. So they're like clearly it's like some love goddess trinity.
See, now that works. It could be like I hate to go here. We don't have to assign them, but like one is like erotic love, one is like familial love, and one is like agape love, or whatever, like just pure like kindness love or whatever. Yeah, I get that.
I mean, honestly, I'm sorting them right now. Peach is erotic love.
Okay, yes.
Daisy is familial love, and Rosalina is just kindness agape.
Now,
so anytime those 3 that like concept comes up and in other things they uncover, they automatically think it's a reference to the 3 princess goddess, the threefold princess goddess. I think that because of their depictions, as opposed to the love side of things, let's get a little bit more carnal. I imagine Zero Suit Samus and Bayonetta would probably be seen as sort of a 2 sides of the same coin for adult relations or whatever, or lust or whatever it is.
Absolutely.
Throw Shulk in there as the male aspect as well, like the male version.
Now, I don't know, because I don't follow competitive Smash super well, but I get the impression that, well, who are the mains in competitive Smash?
Oh man, for Ultimate, it's actually surprisingly fluid, and maybe it's because they've been doing updates. I'm trying to remember, like during my heyday, because I wasn't ever super involved in anything competitive, but when I was more involved in keeping up with Ultimate news, I'm trying to remember who the front runner was for a long time, and I'm blanking on it. But I will say, the Angel Girl, I'm blanking on her name right now, from Kid Icarus, from
Palutena,
yeah, she was big up there for a while.
Really?
And I know people love to hate Pichu because Pichu is so small, he's really hard to hit, but he also has like an incredible moveset. He would totally be, and because people like hate, because he's such a little twerp, people totally think that Pichu is some kind of like chaos demon. Because let's be real, Pichu is kind of a chaos demon.
Yes. So Palutena, since you mentioned her, she's going to be, I think, the Gaia Mother Earth
totally
figure, part of the creation story, who helped, give birth to all of creation. But the reason why I was asking about the mains, and that doesn't work out then, because I was imagining it was going to be something like Fox or Link, would be that will be seen as the Messiah figure, or the like, I don't know, Hercules or Thor style, like the hero of the story, always seen vanquishing everybody else.
Sure, yeah, kind of like a Perseus kind of character.
Yeah, but Pichu doesn't fit that role at all.
Link does. Link fits that role for sure, though, because even if he's not necessarily a victorious main, still like he's been in all the games, right? So there's sort of this idea of progression for him. Also, there's the fact that young Link and Link are in the same game. They would probably use that to interpret the idea of the growing hero.
Gosh.
However, I really want to see if we can figure out how they would incorporate the idea of Toon Link. What is it? His like some kind of simulacrum.
Yeah.
So one of the Bayonetta or something, one of the evil gods, Ganondorf,
produced him.
As a foil. But he did such a bad job. He painted him whatever mischief god they pull out of there.
So then it comes down to who's the villain in this story.
There's so many choices, right?
I know, but but again, like if we try to objectively, just if you had to look at it.
For one, real quick, sorry, carrying on that. Just because they look similar enough, and Link only goes up to a certain point, I believe they would totally misinterpret Simon as being like the oldest version of Link. Link. So it's like young Link, Link, and then
Yep.
Simon, and they probably
Yep.
think that Simon is just another word, another interpretation of Link.
Old Link.
Exactly, old Link.
Accomplish his mission, Link.
Yeah,
I like
buff
that.
and grizzled, old and grizzled Link.
I'm also thinking that all of the oh golly,
I think that maybe the Master Hand or the hands would be
Yes.
seen as probably the ultimate evil.
probably.
Obviously with the puppet master thing and the idea and the fact that they're probably, since they're not actual playable characters and they're only probably referenced in things,
Right.
They're spoken about as hushed whispers. This idea.
Yes.
Sorry, another thought that I had. They would probably, since they have access to Reddit writings about these things, I'm sure they would probably refer to the 34th commandment, or as we know it, Rule 34, and therefore the triad of princesses or whatever would also be in a homoerotic relationship with one another,
Yes.
as well as occasionally bringing in whatever Zelda, the heroic
Yep.
queen, regal
Yep.
figure,
Yep.
and the lust goddesses of Zero Suit Samus.
Yep. Absolutely. 34th commandment. You
The
know
34th commandment. That's
God.
what I want to refer to it as from now on.
I like it.
34th commandment. All right. Any other we could play with it? I mean, literally, we could just do a whole show about this.
I mean, we could. So I'll just very quickly interject again. To kind of round out the pantheon.
Sure.
Kirby is the god of food or gluttony.
Yes. Oh, 100%.
But not in any way that's supposed to be demeaned. And then Jigglypuff is the muses all in one. Jigglypuff is the music god or goddess. So,
yeah.
deity.
For sure. Therefore, they would have thought that the only music that we respected, had any respect for, was karaoke.
Karaoke.
It would be like, clearly
These are the sacred hymns.
They despised musical instruments of any kind and would only ever sing into microphones.
That's right. I love it.
All right, yeah. I wonder what they would think that the GameCubes were. Maybe they thought that it was some kind of. I mean, obviously, there would be some kind of Bible. The consoles themselves would have been seen as, I guess, sacred relics.
Oh, I was thinking your your little at-home altar that you worship at.
Oh, that's it. That's genius. Exactly, because everyone would gather around it
Right.
and worship. That's good. All right, I love it. That's one of my favorite DLCs in a long time. So
Good stuff.
That's DLC. Which leads us to our main topic. We are talking about mythology in video games, mythological video games, mythology games, whatever you want to call it. That's what we are talking about. But let's go ahead, and I'm sure that most of our listeners know what mythology is, but let's sort of set the boundaries here, what we're talking about, and just sort of define mythology for ourselves. So that way, we have boundaries. We know where we can go and where we can't go. So what is mythology? What would you define mythology as?
See, that's the really funny thing. Like you said, we have to draw boundaries, but I feel like we get to set those boundaries for the purpose of this conversation.
For sure.
I tried to. My very first thing that I did when I, first heard what the topic was I typed in my search bar mythology in video games, and immediately fell into this sub discussion of what is a myth versus what is a legend versus what is a folk tale versus what is a fairy tale. So, I think we both agreed that kind of all of those things are up for grabs. But traditionally speaking, if I'm thinking about a myth, I am thinking about or mythology. I'm thinking about a body of work, a series of stories that involve deities of some kind or another. They have to be, if deities aren't there, it's not mythology in my head initially. And they may or may not interact with mortals. And a lot of the stories are used to explain the existence of certain things in nature or the behavior of certain things in nature. It's iffy as to whether the people who are telling the stories believe them to be literally true or not, but they do kind of have a religious connotation. There is a certain sense of because these are deities, we worship them, and it's a religious belief. It's not just a fairy tale story.
For sure, and I agree that they're usually. I would agree that the involvement of gods and religion is a sort of core part, and it's mostly what we're going to be talking about tonight. Though I agree, I think it's fair to bring in folklore and fairy tales and other things like that. Legend, yeah, that's a legend. I'm going to pull from Wikipedia here because they're doing us a solid here again with just the succinct definitions here and also the good caveats. So they describe it as a folklore genre consisting of narratives that play a fundamental role in society, such as foundational tales or origin myths. So yeah, I mean, that I feel like that's a good overarching umbrella because it does. I think it allows for legends and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's foundational tales, things that play a role in society. So of course that would involve religion. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and make the controversial statement here that there is not a religion on this planet that doesn't have some level of mythology associated with it, or has produced some kind of mythology. And that includes the big religions as well. So whether or not you choose to believe the stories are factual, because I'm avoiding specifically the word true. I'm using the specific version of truth that we call facts, because I would argue that of course you believe they're true in some way if you believe in them. But whether or not you believe that they're factual things that happen, they're still mythology because they involve things that can't be proven. It's not historical accounts we're talking about. We're talking about things that happen. And they do also sort of have a caveat sentence here that I want to discuss, only because it's going to take that broad definition and narrow it down to the kind of thing that we're going to probably be mostly talking about tonight. But myths are sometimes distinguished from legend in that myths deal with gods as opposed to people, have no historical basis, and are set in the remote past and very different from the present.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. I think that's a good description of myth. So what are some of the more prominent games that feature mythology, and what are the most commonly used mythologies in video games?
Oh, I mean, we've already mentioned tonight the biggest one that features most prominently that features mythology is God of War, because it got its beginnings in Greek mythology and has in recent years brought Norse mythology into its canon. So that's the one that comes most readily to mind, the one that I'm most prepared to get into. But so you mentioned this earlier just now as a caveat, with major religions. Technically speaking, there is a really terrible NES game out there called Bible Adventures that I used to play.
Gosh.
And that, my friend, is a mythological video game.
Oh, man.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Is that the Bible Man one, or is that something different?
No, this was a very poorly designed game. It basically was 3 games in one. You either were, depending on which game you were playing, you were either Noah trying to collect the animals onto the ark, you were Miriam trying to get Moses safely to the river, or you were David trying to get to and defeat Goliath. It is, I mean, when I say awful, I mean like even down to the fact that it would just like crash. You'd be in the middle of playing the game and it would just crash.
Oh man,
bad. So that's a mythological game.
That's just begging for the that is begging for the the meme that's like, Mom, can I get blank? And Mom says, no,
we already have
blank at home. And like that, I feel like that's begging to be memed in that way right now.
It's, yeah. And then, I mean, this doesn't fit with what you just said about the long past necessarily, but my understanding of mythological games would refer to the Book of Revelation, and we would start looking at things like Darksiders and Dante's Inferno.
Yeah, no, that's a good pull, and that's
but I haven't played either. Well, I've played a little bit of Dante's Inferno, which is like a God of War ripoff.
It was such a God of War ripoff, and I didn't finish it, but
I didn't either.
It was definitely based on a mythological work of fiction, the Divine Comedy, very much based off of it. Although I'll also caveat that by saying very loosely based off of
yes, very. But I haven't played Darksiders, so I can't speak to.
It is very much. It's very much it. I mean, the main characters are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and you play a different one in each game.
There you go.
And yes, it's very much a libertarian, whatever. They liberally adapt that mythology.
Sure.
Very much in the line of what God of War does with Greek and Norse mythology. But it's great games. I think of other games. Smite. It's a MOBA multiplayer game that is again, it's all gods. So you can play as Zeus, you can play as Fenrir or whatever. So they have a whole bunch of playable gods. They recently, it caught my eye recently because they recently introduced a kind of god, a kind of mythological figure into Smite. They introduced the Great Cthulhu. as a playable character in Smite.
That's why I
and
know
I
this
was
game.
like,
Yeah.
I don't want to play that game now. so that was kind of cool. But yeah, there's also mythology featured in games that are not necessarily set in a mythological setting, but feature mythology. So games like Uncharted, they talk about mythology.
Okay, yeah, because I was
yeah.
going to say a little bit of my research too of games that feature mythology. Tomb Raider came up a lot.
Yes.
Yep, for that exact same reason.
Yeah. And then, of course, there are games that are kind of like loosely inspired by mythology. I think of like Shadow of the Colossus, where it's not trying to adapt a mythology per se, but it is like the vibe and the setting is very much they pull from Incan mythology and Incan and Aztec architecture for their but they kind of put a fantasy twist on it, their own kind of intellectual property, but it's very much a like it's sort of has its roots in Central American mythology there. I mean, there's tons of games. I mean, we could pull up a list and just go through them, but there are tons of games that feature. It's a very, very popular flavor, and there's lots of games out there that aren't necessarily, like I said, mythological games that still feature aspects of mythology. Persona 5, you know, all of the enemies you fight, the shades or whatever, they're all mythological beings, pixies, unicorns. Everything from pixies and unicorns to angels and gods and and stuff like that from both Eastern and Western mythologies.
Well, even like, because this wouldn't be 80-bit Pod Smash without referencing this.
Of course.
I've seen a lot about just there is a sense of the Arthurian legend meets Japanese myth in the Zelda franchise. Like it has that feel, like you feel like you're playing in an old world that has established myths from long ago. You're not familiar with them the way you might be familiar with other pantheons.
What, you mean an old man getting a young hero to pull a sword out of a stone is Arthurian?
What?
That's not a ripoff at all.
and if you're paying attention, you'll totally pick up on that. But if you don't, it still just feels familiar, which is what I think is part of why people love mining mythology for. It's familiar enough that it's easy to get somebody to be drawn into it without having to do a ton of world building, right out the gate.
Yeah.
So
we can't forget Age of Mythology,
of course,
Age of Empire. It was made by the same people as Age of Empire, so I was about to call it a ripoff, but it's not. It's just a different thing. More recently, they did, or not they, but more recently, I think of another game that's kind of like it's from an existing franchise that wasn't mythological in nature, but then they made a mythological version of it. The Gods and Monsters, Phoenix Rising, Immortals Phoenix Rising, that's what it's called.
Yeah.
That was sort of a mythological, it was like Assassin's Creed in the mythological setting, not the historical setting. So creators that were, I believe, involved in working on like the Greek version of Assassin's Creed, the Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and they were like, wow, like they included the elements of mythology in that because those games also include lots of mythology from their various time periods. And they were like, wow, we actually want to make a game that's entirely just mythology. So they made Phoenix Immortals Rising. And so I recently played that. So, but yeah, any other games that come to mind or anything, kind of categories of those things that we missed or haven't talked about?
No, not in terms of categories, no.
Yeah, I'm just kind of clicking through some of these here. I think of A Wolf Among Us. Did you ever play A Wolf Among Us?
Is that the Telltale game that's based off the Fable intellectual property?
Yep.
I
know
haven't
you've read
played it, but I'm
so.
super interested in it. Interested in it, but I've never played it.
Dude, I've never played it either. I've played Tales from the Borderlands, though, and I loved it. And
well, that's essentially it, because I love Tales of the Borderlands, and I really enjoy Fable. I was like, this has got to be enjoyable. I have to like it, but
yeah, exactly.
Just never got around to it.
A lot of Chinese mythology games, which makes sense now in hindsight, because they, again, China is a very popular consumer of video games, and so they have a lot.
Yeah,
of
when
stuff.
you and I talked about this initially, I said like, there's just a dearth of anything other than the kind of European mythologies, and then it took exactly 2 seconds of looking online to be like, nope, Japanese and Chinese mythology games definitely exist, and they're churning them out pretty regularly.
Japanese makes sense to me. Chinese also makes sense to me now, specifically, just because of how popular Japan is and how close it is to Japan, and how those two cultures share a lot of historical and mythological DNA. Cool, awesome. Well, let's go ahead and move on to our next question then, which is What's your favorite mythology? What's a mythology that you love? That if you could pick one, it's like I know it's like picking your children, but what's a mythology that you're just like, this is what I am the most into? And I know you're probably a bigger student of mythology than I am, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So yeah, so hands down, my favorite mythology is Greek. There's just so many stories in that canon, if you will, that have been handed
Sure.
down, and there we collectively are always finding a fun new way to retell the stories. Like
Yeah.
Stephen Fry, the actor, he's been in V for Vendetta. He was the British audiobook narrator for the Harry Potter books in Britain. He was in Jeeves and Wooster with Hugh Laurie forever ago. He actually wrote and then narrated the audiobook version of a trilogy of Greek myths retold. 3 independent standalone books. One's just like general myths of Greek mythology. One is specifically about the heroes or the demigods, like Perseus and Theseus and Hercules or Heracles and all them. And the third one is Troy. And he has a way of writing them that, I mean, at times they're just absolutely hilarious. I mean, like you're almost crying laughing because he's using that British like snark and cheek and wit and whatever. And he doesn't contemporize it in terms of like the setting, but he just contemporizes the language a little bit. And then and then there are tragic parts of it too that he'll write it and you just almost, I mean, maybe it's because I'm a dad now, but like you almost cry about some of these stories. And yeah, I could go all day. Oh, the other one I was going to mention too, 3 other books, if you're interested in Greek mythology but don't want to read like actual myths, are Song of Achilles and Circe. Those are 2 different books by a woman named Madeline Miller. She rewrites the story of Troy and the story of the Odyssey, but from the perspective of a minor character in both cases. And then there's a novel called The Gospel of Loki by Joanna Harris. Oh wait, that's Norse. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a whole other recommendation for Norse mythology. Never mind. Nice. Yeah, what about you? What do you prefer? What's your go-to?
Oh man, I've gone through so many phases, which is funny. Like I definitely had my thing where I was like, I was all in on Egyptian mythology, right? Like
of course.
I was a huge lover of animals when I was a kid. There was a period of time when I was a kid where I was like, I want to work for the wildlife, organizations that like rescue wildlife and stuff like that. I was a big animal kid, so of course the fact that like half the deities in that word are depicted with animal heads, I was like, I'm in, like I'm sold. Where can I sign up at the altar of Anubis? I also went through my Greco-Roman phase. I always found it fascinating that Rome just basically copies whatever's popular at the time. Like they went from like, oh, we're gonna basically just take what the Greeks are doing and just change all the names.
Correct.
And then they were like, oh, now we're all like into Christianity now. So they basically just kind of like glom on to whatever is growing in popularity, which I guess makes sense in a republic like that. Sounds familiar. The other sounds familiar, appropriating other cultures when they become popular enough to vote for you.
Yep.
The other thing, so anyways, I had that phase. Definitely then, of course, as I got older, it was like, it's funny because you kind of, I definitely have those tendencies of like chasing the more obscure things as the other things become popular. I know it's a bit of a hipster tendency, not gonna lie, but that definitely was a part of my past where I was just like, Greco-Roman stuff is all over the place. I'm all about Norse mythology now. Get me some Jormungandr action. Only to then like Thor became popular, and now it's just like everywhere. And now it's like Norse, it's everywhere. But I love the Norse because of the primal, the beat, like the sort of. I mean, it wasn't a pretty mythology. It was about valor and grit and grunge, because these were the northern Saxons and Germanic tribes, and they were just a sort of a more gritty, harsh people, which of course matched my sort of teenage and early adulthood years, the personality I was trying to cultivate very nicely, as opposed to the clean Greeks and Romans down to the south. Anyways,
you gotta give it to them, because they also wrote into their mythology like their apocalypse. I mean, they went ahead and was like, here's how it all goes down, and spoiler, everyone dies. Like, if
I do wonder. I mean, wonder how much. I mean, I know the book of Revelations in Western, Christian mythology. I wonder. I know it sort of kind of predates our encounters with Norse mythology. Not necessarily saying that it predates Norse mythology. Right. However, I do wonder how much of the conception of Armageddon, Apocalypse, Armageddon, Revelation, whatever you want to call it. I wonder how much of that perception began to become shaped by the idea of Ragnarok as more and more as Christianity migrated more north towards Britain and England and all that stuff.
Sure.
So I bet you there's some influence there.
We can't claim that there isn't precedence for that. When you look at things like the celebrations of Christmas and Easter, you go like, okay, there's definitely a trend here of what are y'all talking about? I mean, you were alluding to this, but now we're just going to talk about it. Like, what are y'all talking about? Oh, that's our thing. We do that. Yeah, that's ours.
So anyways, just to answer, what's my favorite mythology? I can't really say that I have a favorite right now. What I do love, what I'm most into is I really like stories and sort of mythoses that are crafted by people who are trying to create their own mythologies. So speaking of Tolkien, I love Tolkien's cosmology, love H.P. Lovecraft despite all of his shortcomings. I love the cosmology, the cosmic horror that he created, that idea that in its own way, it's its own kind of pantheon of gods. And it's fascinating to me. I've also always been really interested in Gothic mythology, so to speak. We think of them as horror monsters now, and they kind of are their own genre in a way. But I think they find their roots in mythology. They find their roots in folklore. So, of course, your vampires, your werewolves, your zombies, all that is kind of rooted in mythological origins. And I've always found that fascinating, especially, we have a whole series dedicated to those monsters that we do every Halloween, called our Monster Smash episodes, so I won't spend too much time there, but there's some, like, in every one of those episodes we always talk about what are the origins of these monsters and how they've come to dominate and occupy our sort of collective human mind space. And they're always all fascinating because they always have some like really cool explanation, like interesting explanation that's rooted in something that people would have observed in the past, only then to also then be mythologized in really cool ways. So that's kind of where I live.
That's interesting, because what I thought you were going to say when you talked about authors creating their own mythos, and I don't know if you're aware of this yet or not, depending on how far you've gotten into Eye of the World.
I'm not very far.
But Robert B. Jordan deliberately wrote his series in such a way that it would be like prehistory. Like, go all the way back before anything else is recorded. This is what happened. And as you read the series, you'll see it, because they'll be like, wow, that feels a little bit like a Norse myth, or that feels a little bit like Buddhist teaching, or that feels a little bit like, and he's like, yeah, because this is what actually happened before all the religions of the world splintered off and took their version of what happened.
Oh, nice.
And adapted a little bit. Like, his is the ultimate pre-story of everything, all the way down to like Confucianism and Taoism and Egyptian mythology, like all of it. Like, it's not heavy-handed. It's not like, Anubis, a jackal-headed god, is gonna be walking around making an appearance. But you'll start to pick up, especially on the first couple books, you'll see some of that for real.
Interesting. Yeah, I know Tolkien also was sort of famous for saying that his intention was to write a European myth or an English mythology, because he didn't think that they had a proper one. Yeah, which is that crap, because there totally was. There is totally that in totally influencing English history and religion and everything. But it's just kind of funny. Tolkien's like, no, we don't have one, so I'm writing one for us.
Don't like it. Doing my own.
All right, bro. So, all right, cool. Let's move on to the next question, because I think this is gonna be a fun one. So, moving back to video games, why is mythology, you think, commonly, and we just talked about a ton of video games, and there's so many more than we were able to talk about, but why do you think it's such a common and frequently used video game setting?
So I started to kind of say this a little bit earlier, then realized I was jumping the gun. I think it's so accessible for material. If you're, let's say you have like a mechanic, or you have an idea, but you don't know what the bones of it need to look like. That's their go-to. It's kind of like how I understand a game developer uses a game engine to create a game. They don't have to do everything themselves. They just have to come up with the details. It's the same kind of thing. It's like, oh, I want to have a sword slasher. Or, oh, I want to have a open world game. Oh, I want to have a, fill in the blank. You can start with a cast of characters, or an aesthetic, or a goal, or a narrative, and then adapt it however you want.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't. In talking about games earlier, the mythology games, I'm kicking myself now for not saying Hades earlier, but like that kind of seems like how Hades was conceived, where it's just like, hey, we have this idea for a roguelike, right? We have these, solid mechanics, and we have this whole idea
Hmm.
of having to try to get somewhere only to have to loop back around. But the whole idea
Mm,
of the time loop is kind of played out now. So many games
yep.
have done it. So like, well, what if we had a character who was trying to get out of hell, get out of the underworld?
Yep.
Oh, let's make it the Greek
Yep.
underworld, and
Yep.
it's Hades' son, and he's trying to escape.
Yep.
And he keeps having to come, like, every time he dies, he comes back because he's immortal.
Yep.
It's just like, yeah, that makes sense.
And I think
So
what
like,
you do when you do that is, instead of, like, when you do that, you automatically have people feeling comfortable
yes,
looking into it, instead of like, oh, it's set in a spaceship and their clones keep regenerating. And we're like, what the crap? Like, okay, but what is the point of the game? Like,
yes, that much aligned sci-fi space genre that we all hate so much.
But when it's already something familiar and comfortable, then you've already got people engaged or interested.
Sure,
I mean,
you're taking less risk by trying to come up with your own thing that may be stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree totally. I think the other thing too is that it's I mean, they're kind of the OG fantasy stories. I love
absolutely.
I love the Terry Pratchett quote where he, someone basically was like, "Why don't you write proper literature?" And Terry Pratchett is like, "Please, all literature, or all of the literature that you love, or much of the literature you love, finds its roots in what you would now describe as fantasy. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the oldest story we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is like a story of a superhuman dude who goes around and kills a bunch of monsters. That's fantasy."
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, just like fantasy, it's full of magic, monsters, heroes, gods, and all those things lend themselves well to video game mechanics when you want a basis to go off of. It's already got magical swords, so like, how do you now, like you said, the detail is just trying to figure out how your magic sword works.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other piece I think that's really important for understanding why mythology is so frequently used in video games is a very, very practical one. It's all public domain.
Free.
You don't have to pay anyone to adapt it. No royalties. So, any other reasons you think that they're used? Any other ideas? Anything come to mind in our discussion? Or can we move on to the next question?
No, that's it.
Word. All right. So, we talked about mythologies that have been used a lot. What are some more obscure mythologies or mythologies that haven't been explored or have been rarely used or loosely used that you find interesting?
So there is a novel series I've read called the Iron Druid Chronicles. And the main character is, long story short, he is like essentially immortal. He's a 2,000-year-old Irish druid.
Okay.
And so a lot of the characters from his books are the Celtic pantheon, and it has really whet my appetite to learn more about the Celt gods. They are really cool, really fascinating people that I would love to see more in any form, including just a book. But I if you told me there was a Celtic mythology video game, I'd definitely pick it up and check it out, because I would love to see that.
Sure. Historical druids in general. Like, I mean, video game, thanks to D&D, video games have basically just interpreted druid as like nature mages, like magic people who use magic that is extremely like nature oriented or whatever. But like real life druids were like, there was a great Stuff You Should Know on it, and real life druids were like just like smart dudes. Like there's just a class of people who were educated. So like anyone from like doctors, lawyers, but also priests and religious folk. And yeah, sure, they lived out in nature, but that's because everybody lived out in nature.
Correct.
in the Celtic times.
The other one I would love to see, this is a very niche thing, but when I thought about mythology earlier, so there has to be some kind of game that's based in Slavic mythology, because I just really want to see some like Baba Yaga nonsense. I want to see this like insane witch lady riding around in her hut on chicken legs, and I don't know if she's supposed to be like a merchant that sells you things as you travel through the forest, or if she's actually the antagonist, or if she's like I don't know what it is, but I just want to see Baba Yaga in a video game for some reason.
Nice. There is actually one of the Wikipedia categories is on Slavic mythology. They have referenced The Witcher, and that is I would agree that I think it's definitely got its origin. I mean, Andrzej Sapkowski is Polish, so it definitely has its origins in Slavic mythology, but it's more of a fantasy take on that. Baba Yaga did feature in one of the Tomb Raider games, though. There was a Baba Yaga like DLC or something in Rise of the Tomb Raider. I remember playing. So I've definitely seen it. It's
But
not.
but is it again? Is it Laura interacting around the mythology of her? Yeah, I know. I want to see her.
you want you want playable Baba Yaga. You just want Baba Yaga the video game.
Yeah, I want Baba Yaga in a video game.
More importantly, you want like Baba Yaga 3. You want this franchise to be so popular that we're sitting there being like, all right, Baba Yaga 8's about to come out. Baba Yaga 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Stop.
All right. I was thinking like immediately, we mentioned how like Incan and Aztec influenced Shadow of the Colossus, but they're not explicitly. I would love to see some ancient Native American, whether it's the sort of northern, continental tribes like the Cherokee and the Blackfoot that had a very rich, interesting, religion and mythological structure, very sophisticated religion. We usually think of like the Thunderbird and stuff, and the way they tend to be depicted in video games is like embarrassing and also offensive, I think, where it's just like I think of like Nightwolf from Mortal Kombat, or apparently I looked up the main character from Prey is like, he's got Cherokee mythology, which means he's a spirit walker, so he comes back when he dies. It's like, that's so just like hashtag basic. It's like someone basically just Googled like Native American mythology and then just literally copied the first
thing.
Yeah, exactly, the first sentence. So I would love to have people who know what they're doing make a game like that, preferably people of Native American descent who actually have respect for that culture and have been influenced by that culture. Would be awesome to see that. But also just going south into the more Central American, those huge civilizations of Aztec and Inca and Mayan, incredible mythology. In fact, I'm surprised Mayan hasn't been adapted as much because of the 2012 apocalypse philosophy thing or whatever prediction. Like that seems to me like low-hanging fruit that the video game industry, I can't think of a game that really properly adapted Aztec mythology or Mayan mythology. So those would be some that I would love to see more of. I also think like India, Hindu has like a huge, and there's a category on Wikipedia, but there's only a handful of games. They look more like there's a fighting game called Asura's Wrath or whatever, and so which is fine. I'm totally not trying to knock on Asura's Wrath. It's probably a fine game with a fine video gamey interpretation of Hindu or Indian mythology, but they have such a huge pantheon. I think they're both of those cultures that I mentioned. I think probably part of the reason is they're complicated and hard to understand because they're not English, they're not Eurocentric, and so Eurocentric people who have been raised on that, like they don't quite understand the cultures around how those things were made, and so they get complicated. I mean, even just the names can be hard to understand and hard to follow.
Right. This is where you're definitely hitting on what I was going to use as my answer to our last question to close out, is that I specifically have in my notes talking about wanting to see some like Mesoamerican or either Indian games, and in the case of India specifically, I remember Pixar did a short video one time about this young boy, and his father just wants him to pray with him. It's Indian, and his father just wants him to pray with him, and he just wants to play with his action figures, his superhero action figures, and he ends up falling asleep and has this whole dream where essentially he reimagines three of the main gods of the Indian pantheon as superheroes fighting. And that's the kind of, and you very quickly realize if you stick around for the credits that this is actually a man from India who's doing this. And that's where I would say I want to see these games, but I want to see the people who are steeped in the culture and actually understand it and didn't just hire a consultant or say like, oh, that seems kind of cool. Like people who actually have a love or an appreciation for it and a history with it, telling the story of it.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think as I mentioned to you when we were talking about, when we were kind of just back and forth about doing this episode, one of the things that I think is like important to note as to why these types of games haven't been adapted and why we see so many Egyptian, Greek, Christian, and Norse mythologies in games is that sort of idea that like all of those cultures were sort of around, the hotbed of Western civilization. Even though Egypt is a bit more of a African Arabic, I mean, that area was still around and nearby the cultures that would be the foundation of our civilization. So Western American culture is very much, I mean, we're like the great grandbabies of Rome, right? And so and so yeah, so again, that's why Greek was right next door to the Roman Empire. the Roman Empire would, effectively the seat of the Roman Empire would eventually move to Britain in a lot of ways, as far as like sort of the next big Western empire. And that would be, a very Christian civilization, but it was also influenced by that neighbor to the north of the Norse. So it's like, it's that little pillar, that little area right there. And it only goes so far, right? It doesn't go south of the Nile. You don't see a lot of, stories about Anansi from that Central African tribal folklore, because we don't have an interest in exploring that, because again, it really stops in Egypt, and then it doesn't really go much farther east than like Mesopotamia, and until you get to China, and then suddenly but China's its own thing. China and Japan, they're their own thing. They're like a separate category in sort of the Western mind. And so then we kind of come back around to being interested in them, but really like them, but only loosely interested in them. Like if you start really digging into the Chinese stuff, most Westerners I think would probably snore, just because it's not, again, we know so much, and archaeologists and our archaeologists, our historians have spent so much time understanding Egyptian, Greek, Norse, and Christian mythology that like those are the big influences. And more than just that, those are the sort of foundations, those whatever principles those cultures have espoused, they really form the roots of our cultural values and the stories that we resonate with. So that's why you get lots of resurrection myths in all of those stories, or all of those mythologies, because the idea of, the one savior of mankind conquering death, like it's prominent in almost all of those cultures, and therefore it's prominent in all of our pop culture as well, because it's foundational. So all right, cool. Next question is, what do you think is the best mythology game, and why is it God of War?
I mean, doesn't it answer itself?
It really does.
Well, let's be clear. So we're talking about the most recent game that came out, not the whole franchise, right?
Sure, if that's what you want to narrow it down to.
Well, I would say, like, I mean, the reason why I say that is because this is just shooting from the hip. I enjoyed the first 3 God of War games. They're, fun.
Yeah.
God of War. Is that what we're just calling it? Is the 4th one just God of War?
It unfortunately is just God of War, right? Like they didn't pop a number on it, which is unfortunate because like, it's just unfortunate because it literally does share the exact same name. As far as a registered trademark goes, it shares the same name with the first game.
That's fine. Yes. Whatever.
But I know what you're talking about.
For this conversation, 2018 is the only God of War. That game took me on an emotional journey. Yeah. And I mean, like, I think you and I had a very similar experience of, at some point in the game, if it wasn't at the very end, it was before that. Like, I mean, tears just streaming down our faces playing that game.
It was the moment for me was when... The moment for me that broke me, I don't think I cried necessarily, but I was like close to it. And I think if I had been a dad at the time, I played that game before my son was born. And if I had been a dad at the time, I would have probably had an emotional reaction to it, a visible emotional reaction. The moment for me was when, after Atreus goes on his little temper tantrum, his little I'm a god now. And then the moment where Kratos like disciplines him and says, but his form of discipline is like, he basically is like, don't be sorry, be better. Like, you need to be better than me. Like, you have the opportunity. You can correct my mistakes, or you don't have to basically repeat and relive my mistakes, and you can be better than me. And I'm like, oh, I want to be a daddy. This is my daddy, and I'm also going to be a daddy. And
yeah. So, I mean, so that is a perfect moment of what I'm talking about. So, like, especially with Greek mythology, which I know this game is set in Norse mythology, but Kratos is Greek in origin. Greek. Yep. And he's a half deity of a Greek god. I've read a lot about mythology, not just read mythology. And the thing about the Greek mythology especially is how much the gods are unapologetically just petulant a-holes. Children and a-holes. Yeah, like they are no better than people.
Yes.
So that moment specifically for me had that element that you're talking about, except I had a kid by then, so it was gut-wrenching. But also it's a sense of like, it's elevating this character of like, no, he actually is like, in a way that we don't normally mean it, being superhuman. He is telling his son, he is himself trying to be a better person and telling his son to be a better person instead of giving into his baser deity nature. We think that the deities are the higher elevated natures, but they're not actually. The humans are. And I loved that moment. But it's
Right, and
also,
Kratos is like recognizing too that like, or it's important to recognize that like the Greek gods deserved it. Like the
yeah.
hell that Kratos
Mm-hmm.
wrought upon them, the
Mm-hmm.
slaughter and brutality, they deserved it.
Oh,
Like you
look at
said,
this.
because they were
Consequences of my actions.
right. But at the same time, the irony being though that Kratos wasn't punishing them out of a sense of justice.
Oh,
Kratos wasn't
no.
punishing them out of a sense of like, oh, these are people who need to be, these are oppressors that need to be taken down for the good of mankind. He was doing it because he wanted to, which is
Yeah.
exactly the same behavior. So
Yep.
Kratos recognizes that in himself. And, basically Kratos is a character who hates gods, and that hatred
Including.
extends to himself and
Correct.
extends to his son.
Correct.
He spends the first half of the game not wanting to admit that the reason he's being so cold to his son is because he hates himself that he sees in his son. But he loves the Fae, his wife. He loves the aspects of his son that he sees that he inherited from his spouse. But like, so he still loves his son, but there are things that he hates about his son because he hates himself. It's like it's so much like themes of like forgiveness and self-acceptance, and also the acceptance of others, and also teaching others how to take responsibility for themselves. It's so good.
And so that is the answer to the question of, it could have been a simple, this is why I wanted to differentiate it from the rest of the franchise. It could have been a simple, really fun to play hack and slash, let's go kill some gods game.
Sure, absolutely.
And they said, no, we can do better. We can tell a better story than that.
It's because they grew up. It's because they, as game developers,
Yes.
their team had grown up. And when they made God of War, it was that height of Space Marine, gritty, grungy Space Marine. It was basically video games adolescence, right? Where basically all the games that were coming out were just like super shallow shooters with BA protagonists who wholesale slaughtered people without any regret, and that's what God of War. That's what the God of War franchise was. But the reason I say that, like, we have to talk about the franchise as a whole and not just the single game in a vacuum, is because God of War 4 or God of War 2018 would not be as good as it was without the context of the first three games.
Oh,
and
sure.
The fact that you have this character that is so one-dimensional and just such a revenge fantasy and administered such brutality, only to have him basically experience a complete redemption. Like, yeah, you can't have one Kratos without the other, and you can't have one story without the other, which to me, it's one of the best examples of a franchise that was able to turn itself around and make something beautiful out of something that was, quite frankly, juvenile.
Yeah.
In its original context. So, but even so, like, but I don't want to just trash the original series. Like, God of War blew me away when I first played it. The first game, I remember it was back when I was living with my roommate Chris, and he was recently featured on a stream of ours. We did he and I played Guild Wars 2 together, but we were in like the height of our WoW days, and at one point I just needed a break, and I think someone had given him that game or something. It was on his shelf and he had never touched it, and I was like, hey, I'm gonna play your game, God of War, and he was like, all right, whatever, I don't have any interest in it. I started playing it and I loved it, and then he started watching me play it, and he started wanting to play it with me, and we played it like we would just trade off. And we both ended up falling in love with the game because it was kind of the first experience I ever had with the mythology game that I loved, while at the same time blending elements of both hack and slash games like Devil May Cry with the action combat with puzzle solving in a way that was just brilliantly done at the time. Very, very Zelda-esque in the puzzle solving, and that, again, that carries through into that whole streamline, that whole through line carries into the most recent games, or the most recent game. So I'm really excited about Ragnarok.
Listening to you talk about your experience with the first games did remind me of my first experiences playing with them, and especially the first game. I would have to say it's most akin to the experience I had, and this is a whole cousin genre we haven't talked about at all, to when I saw the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. And I was like, wow,
Yes.
what I have always pictured in my head, or what is always just kind of on a page, is coming out at me on the screen, and it is amazing. Like, this is just as good as I thought it could be, but instead of a comic book, it was mythology. Like,
yeah.
To see deities. I mean, there's those old, Harryhausen films and whatever, and I'm not dissing what he did with his technology of stop motion and whatnot, but like,
sure.
But that game, there was a certain amount of just like this, and it's one, it's just awe, and two, like, this is just fun. Like, it's fun.
It's very fun. Well, and it's interesting too, because I feel like the story of the first game is, in many ways kind of, it's simple, but it's justifiable, right? Like, Kratos was a Spartan and was driven to, he worshipped Ares, the god of war, right? And then, like, was driven to such bloodlust by Ares that he didn't realize it when he killed his own family. And so the entire game is, you are going to kill Ares. You're bringing justice or vengeance, whichever way you want to see it, to Ares. I actually never played the second game, and maybe I missed out on some context there, but I kind of jumped right into the third one years later. And by then, his character development was just like, I'm getting after Zeus, because apparently Zeus was the one behind it all along. But by then, I feel like the series kind of had jumped the gun a bit and just became about a god. Like, originally it was like, we're going to kill the god of war because he's an a-hole that messed with this guy's life. And I'm on board for that. But eventually it just became like, okay, we took that idea of killing a god and ratcheted it up to 11. And now we're killing all the gods. And like, I remember, like, I played God of War 3. It's a great game. It's a fine, excellent, sort of button on the original trilogy. That said, there was definitely a moment that I think was intentional where, like, I think it was when you kill Hermes and, like, literally you have, like, a real-time event where you have to, like, saw his legs off to get his shoes. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, are we the baddies? Like, am I a bad guy? Like, am I playing a dude who is not a good dude? And again, it's fun that I went on that journey, though, because at the same time, like, that's actually what I think you're meant to feel, or at least by the time you get around to God of War 4, you're meant to sort of sit in the weight of this character who has done awful things and doesn't know how to atone for them, much less how to be a good father having done those things. And it's just like, that's what we all are, right? Like, that's why I think it's so relatable, is because we're all that guy. Every father in the world is that guy. We've done things we regret. We've behaved in ways that we are ashamed of, and we have to carry that into our parenting. And some fathers buckle under the weight of the pressure, and some fathers rise above. But I think Kratos is, like, in many ways, the everyman in that regard, because he is the epitome of it, right? So, anyways, so I guess that ultimately, the second part of that question is, what makes God of War's handling of mythology so special? I think it's really just, it's a combination of things, right? It's both quality in how they sort of pull in and put their own twist on every myth and legend, like every myth they adapt, every god they put their own little spin on them, their own little look. I think that's really important in regards to adapting this, is you don't want to just, in many ways, you don't want to be necessarily exactly true to the reality of it. You want to put your own spin on it, and you can afford to do that because it's public domain. You're not offending anyone's artistic integrity by doing that. Furthermore, you also just, again, you want to make it relatable to the human experience, because, again, these things are stories about gods who aren't supposed to be relatable necessarily to the human experience. So the fact that so I think that the biggest thing that God of War demonstrates in how to handle these mythologies is the fact that he makes it so human. They make it such a human tale, like you were mentioning. And as opposed to this sort of like, okay, who cares if gods kill each other because they're gods? God of War makes it so that you realize, like, oh, these are relatable characters. They're not just gods. They're people. They're folk. And so killing them has consequences. Great. Good stuff. Any other thoughts about God of War?
Similarly, Ragnarok cannot come here soon enough.
I know, for sure. All right, real quick, what do you think are some pitfalls or challenges in adapting mythology to video games specifically?
I mean, I think you just kind of sort of touched on that, where you walk a fine line between how strictly are you going to hold to the source and be a purist, and how much are you going to interpret or run away with and do your own thing. Because I think that there are people who probably think, like, we can't do that because the text doesn't provide for that, or that's too far-fetched, or people who go the exact opposite and go, like, I just want a skin for the character I already have in mind, or I just
Right.
want like the terms for the concept I already have. At which point it's not really mythology, and that's fine. It's just inspired by. But I am definitely less inclined to be interested in a game that just uses a bunch of god skins
Smite.
and yeah, like I would much rather see a game that actually tries to weave that original narrative into the story they want to tell, like God
Sure,
of War, what
something
they did.
meaningful. Yep.
So I think that it's easy to start. It's hard when you choose mythology as your genre, but it can be very tricky to finish it well if you don't put a lot of thought into it,
Yeah,
I
kind of
think.
like a low. There's like a low barrier, a low floor, a low skill
Yeah.
floor, so to
Yeah.
speak. High skill ceiling in regards to like this can be
Exactly.
something that can be really magical when done well, but so few games actually do it really well
Yep.
in this space. I think there's a couple of things here that are important to highlight. There's number one, the idea of cultural appropriation, the idea of like, and even I think God of War can be kind of guilty of this sometimes, where you have certain cultural considerations that you need to make. Are you actually honoring the cultures where these mythologies come from?
Mm-hmm.
And are you understanding them correctly? Because in your interpretation, and I think and that also might be a pretty good reason why like Indian and Hindu mythology hasn't been adapted very well as much as I would like to see it. I also, like you said, I would want to see it by someone who understands it and knows it
Mm-hmm.
and has been influenced and shaped by it in meaningful way, not just not just EA being like executives being like, well, let's mine that now for
Mm-hmm.
some easy cash and we'll slap it on to a half-baked story and make $1 million. Like, no. So and we discussed kind of tangential to this. You and I've discussed it with a lot of people. Apparently I'm and Termite actually accused me of this when I brought it up to him. He was like, he's told me that I'm really worried about the Norse saga of God of War ending. They did confirm that this is the last game that's going to take Ragnarok's the last game that's going to take place in the Norse saga, and that brings up some really interesting conundrums for them, and that is related to this idea of cultural appropriation. Because by saying this is the end of the Norse saga, you're implying that they're going to do other sagas in other mythologies. But like, I have to wonder, what other mythologies can they do that can honor that they can be honorable when you consider the fact that the main characters are white guys, right? So
Right.
if Kratos survives this saga and he's still the playable character, it presents the same problem as if he passes off the mantle to Atreus. They're both white dudes, and if you have a white dude going around killing brown gods, that's a problem. Like that will be perceived as something that's problematic. If it's not handled well. And alternatively, if you depict, say, for example, the Egyptian pantheon as either monsters or like white folk, like white conqueror gods or whatever, who are like oppressing their Egyptian Arabic
Yeah.
subjects, like then you fall into the white savior trope where Atreus or Kratos comes in and kills all their gods and saves the people and frees them or whatever. It's like, oh, that's a white savior trope. If you go to Japan or China with the mythology, then you have the sort of Western imperialism ickiness that is like, ugh. So I don't know where they're going to go next. And I don't know. I was hoping that the Norse saga would be a trilogy, and so we could kind of kick the can down the road. But the fact that they're ending it means that there are those questions that come up, and I don't know how they're going to handle them. So, yeah.
I understand all of those concerns. I think that we have a lot of time before we have to be worried that they're going to misappropriate any indigenous darker skinned people and depict a white man smashing the face in of a dark skinned man simply for more fodder to keep the franchise going to make more money. I think to your point, the most recent game shows me that the team has grown and matured, and I'm not saying that makes them perfect. I just think that they're going to be thoughtful, period,
I think so
about
too.
what they do next. Whatever they do next will be thoughtful.
Sure.
So.
And they've gotten a lot of flack recently for interpreting. So they revealed that the Atreus is going to have a love interest.
Right.
They haven't explicitly said that, but anybody who knows the mythology
Yeah.
when the character was named has an understanding if she's going to be a love interest.
Yeah.
And she's been depicted as black, and they've gotten backlash from the worst parts of the gaming culture.
I bet.
From that choice. But I do think it's a strategic choice because it could imply that they may be already trying to address that point. in creative ways, potentially skipping a generation and passing the mantle off not to Atreus himself, but to Atreus's offspring, who may be depicted as like mixed at the very least. So there's, I agree that this is a team that has proven that they know how to handle the material respectfully and will probably make good choices. I just hope they don't accidentally make bad choices, because I wouldn't want the franchise is so good, I wouldn't want it to be tarnished by something that wasn't thought out fully in its entirety and its implications. So, sure. Anyways, yeah, so I think that, that presents one challenge in general. I think there's other challenges in, them just misunderstanding or misinterpreting the mythology. That kind of goes hand in hand, part and parcel, with what I talked about. And then there's the idea that there's sort of this, because it's got such a low barrier of entry that you were mentioning, there's sort of an oversaturation problem where you could have 5 games all that depict Zeus, and only one of them depicts him in a way that's interesting and cool. And all the rest are just garbage or cliche or whatever however you want to put it, just something that's just not good, because it's public domain. Anyone can do it. Anyone can make a story about Zeus, but can you make a story about Zeus interesting? That's harder. Yeah. So there's not sort of that pressure to do it right for all of those games. So I think that's another challenge. So, All right, we are out of time for our last question, so I think we're going to end there. Do you have any closing thoughts on mythology and video games?
I think it's going to be really great to see what comes out in 2023. Is that when they said they're going to do it?
They're still shooting for 2022.
I hope so.
Termite and I both predict that if it's going to be 2022, it's probably going to be November or December, like a late fall.
That makes sense.
Holiday release.
That makes complete sense.
But they've shown off enough gameplay that, they showed off enough gameplay in August of 2020 or September of 2021 that I think a 2022 release is
feasible.
Of course, barring all COVID complications. So
sure, always.
Yeah, right. This always happens to me where we list out a bunch of video game examples, and then later I think of one that I'm like, oh, I need to say at least Senua's Sacrifice. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. Norse mythology. Amazing.
Wrote that down as one I haven't played, but to get you to talk about. Dadgummit.
It's a good one. Yeah, we have to at least pay homage to that because it's one of my favorite games of the last, 5 years or so. Anyway, so that's the show. Thank you all for listening. I guess I have to do the thing where I share all the places you can interact with us. If you have thoughts on mythology, mythological video games, we want to hear those thoughts. If you love them, hate them, what are your favorites? And what do you think they do well, and what challenges do they face? We want to hear all those thoughts and more. You can share them with us. You can go to 80bitpodsmash.com. There's our landing website where you can find links to all of our social media platforms, Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, Twitter, where you can share your thoughts with us, interact with us. You can go to our Discord channel, which is in our, there's going to be a list of our episodes on our website. There's going to be notes in each one of those episodes, and there are links to Discord in those show notes. Those show notes should also be on whatever platform you're listening to. So hit that read more button or whatever, and click that Discord link to talk with us on Discord and talk with us live. If you want more content from us, you can find us at twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, where we go live twice a week, usually. Wednesday nights, we do a weekly Wednesday live stream of whatever game we're playing. Terminite and I usually alternate, though it's mostly been me playing Dark Souls the last few weeks. And then on Mondays, we usually do a live show where we talk about the video game news. We call it the 80-Bit Newscast. So you can check that out as well, Monday nights at 8. And we haven't been doing that one as much because of the moving, but you should check all that stuff out. Subscribe. You can check them out later on YouTube if you prefer. There's a link there on our website as well. That's everything. Episodes go live Monday. The next episode, we are probably going to do that episode about the Xbox One. Of course, things are kind of up in the air right now because Termite's moving, so don't be married to that as something that is absolutely going to happen next week. But thank you, Ryan, again for joining us. Is there anything I can plug, Instagram or Twitter or something that you would want people to find you on, or do you want to just remain obscure?
Absolutely not. I don't want anybody to find me on the internet.
Great. Then please don't go looking for him. Please don't go searching for him. If you know him in real life, you can yell at him or send him a carrier pigeon.
That's right.
Then great. Well, thank you for joining again. Thank you for filling in for Termite for the week and talking about God of War with me. And we will see you all, or Termite and I will hopefully see you all next week.
Bye.